she's looking at you, but she's not seeing you. Her eyes hold something else entirely, a flicker of possibility, a shadow of who she thinks you could become. You feel chosen, don't you? Special. Like she's found something in you that others have missed. But Carl Jung would shake his head and tell you the truth. She hasn't found you at all. She's found her projection. Jung spent decades mapping the human unconscious, diving into the darkest corners of the psyche that most people refuse to acknowledge, and what he discovered about women would make most men deeply uncomfortable. He found that they don't fall in love with men, they fall in love with fantasies, with invisible scripts, with psychological puppets they create in their own minds. And the most dangerous part? Most of them have no idea they're doing it. You think you're being seen for who you are, but you're being measured against an invisible standard that exists only in her unconscious mind. Stay until the end. Jung's insight about the unconscious feminine force will change how you see every relationship you've ever had. You think she chose you, but what she actually chose was the version of you that exists only in her imagination. Jung called this projection, the unconscious process where we cast our inner world onto others, seeing not what is, but what we need to see. Every woman carries within her what Jung termed the animus, the inner masculine image, the psychological blueprint of what a man should be. This isn't conscious. She doesn't wake up and decide to project. It happens in the shadows of her mind, driven by forces she's never examined. And this animus is undeveloped, immature, or unconscious. It becomes something far more dangerous than attraction. It becomes possession. She doesn't see your actual strength. She sees the strength she's imagined. She doesn't love your real vulnerability. She loves the vulnerability that fits her script. Jung observed this in his practice repeatedly. Men who came to him broken, confused, wondering why they felt like actors in their own relationships. Because that's exactly what they were. Actors. She had written the script before she met you. You just happened to audition at the right time with the right look, the right energy to play the leading role. And you mistake being cast in her private movie for being understood. The animus speaks to her in absolutes. It tells her what men should do, how they should think, what they should provide. It judges without context. It demands without reciprocity. Jung saw this pattern destroy relationship after relationship. The woman falls in love with her projection. The man falls in love with being chosen. But neither is loving the other, they're loving fantasies. When you fail to match that inner voice, when you reveal aspects of yourself that don't fit her unconscious script, you don't just disappoint her, you become the enemy of her ideal. Most men never recognize this psychological theater. You confuse being desired with being known. You mistake her passion for your performance as love for your person. You think when she says you're different that she sees something unique in you, but Jung would tell you she simply found someone willing to play the role her animus has been auditioning for years. The tragedy is that an immature animus makes women chase dangerous men and reject stable ones. It makes them argue without logic, judge without wisdom, and demand without accountability. Not because they're evil, because they're unconscious. They're possessed by an inner masculine force they've never acknowledged, let alone integrated, and that force uses you as its puppet, its projection screen, its unwitting actor. You think you're building a relationship. Jung would tell you you're just rehearsing someone else's fantasy. And the most painful part? You volunteer for this role. You audition eagerly, because being chosen, even for a lie, feels better than being alone with the truth. Jung didn't speak softly about this. He called it spiritual possession. A state where the woman herself becomes unaware that she's no longer acting from her own consciousness, but from the shadowy grip of her inner masculine fantasy. Picture this. She meets you and immediately begins the unconscious process of casting. Not casting you as yourself, but casting you as the lead character in a story she's been writing since childhood. The animus whispers its demands. Be stronger, be more successful, be the provider, be the protector, be the emotional rock. Be everything her father was or wasn't. Be the missing piece of her incomplete psychological puzzle. And you, hungry for love, hungry for validation, hungry to be chosen, you agree to audition. You mold yourself, you perform, you become the man you think she wants, rather than the man you actually are. Jung observed this pattern in relationship after relationship. The woman falls in love with her projection, not the person. The man falls in love with being chosen, not with being known. But here's where it gets darker. When the projection inevitably cracks, when reality seeps through the fantasy, she doesn't blame herself for the mismatch. She blames you. You're not romantic enough, you're not ambitious enough, you're not present enough. You've changed. You're not the man she fell in love with. But Jung would tell her the truth she doesn't want to hear. She never fell in love with a man at all. She fell in love with a psychological ghost, a figment of her unconscious imagination. The animus is merciless when it's unconscious. It demands perfection from men while offering nothing in return. It criticizes without understanding, it judges without empathy, it expects without reciprocating. Jung documented case after case of women possessed by immature animus energy becoming impossible to please. Not because they were inherently difficult, but because they were chasing an inner image that no real man could ever fulfill. This possession manifests in ways most men recognize but don't understand. She becomes argumentative for no apparent reason. She picks fights about things that seem insignificant. She tests you constantly, pushing boundaries, creating conflict. You think she's being difficult. Jung would tell you she's being possessed. The animus, when unconscious, turns women into critics of masculinity rather than companions to it. They become experts on what men should do while remaining completely unconscious of their own psychological patterns. The psychological tragedy is that both of you become trapped. She becomes trapped in endless disappointment because reality can never match fantasy. You become trapped in endless performance because you're trying to become someone who doesn't exist. Jung called this projection the theft of reality. It steals what is and replaces it with what should be. It murders authentic connection and births psychological slavery. And the cruelest part? The harder you try to fulfill her projection, the more she unconsciously resents you, because deep down, some part of her knows that a real man wouldn't lose himself trying to become her fantasy. The animus is attracted to mystery, to challenge, to men who cannot be fully grasped or controlled. But you, in your desperation to be loved, make yourself completely knowable, completely available, completely predictable. You think you're being a good man. Jung would tell you you're being a psychological slave. You think you're loving her, but you're only loving the feeling of being chosen by her. And she thinks she's loving you, but she's only loving the character she's convinced herself you are. The real tragedy is that this pattern repeats until one of you breaks free from the unconscious dance. And most people never do. Jung offered no easy solutions, no three-step programs, no shortcuts to masculine awakening. He offered only one path: individuation, the brutal, lifelong process of becoming whole within yourself, of facing every part of your psyche you've spent years avoiding, of confronting the weak, the broken, the terrified parts of your soul that you've buried beneath performance and pretense. Most men will never take this journey. You know why? Because you've been trained from birth to seek approval, to chase validation, to let others define your worth. Your mother's approval shaped your early understanding of love. Your teacher's grades determined your sense of intelligence. Your peers' acceptance decided your social value. Your boss's recognition defines your professional worth. And finally, her love becomes the ultimate validation of your manhood. You've lived your entire life as a supporting character in other people's stories, always asking, am I good enough? Am I worthy? Am I chosen? Never asking, who am I when no one is watching? What do I value when no one is validating? What do I stand for when no one is applauding? But Jung asks a different question, the question that terrifies most men into lifelong psychological sleep. Who are you when you strip away every mask you've worn to earn love? This is the beginning of individuation, the slow, painful process of distinguishing between who you are and who you've learned to be. Jung knew this work was brutal because it requires you to confront everything you've used relationships to avoid. Your loneliness, your inadequacy, your fear of being unlovable, just as you are. Most men use women as psychological shields against these uncomfortable truths. If she loves you, you must be worthy. If she chooses you, you must be valuable. If she needs you, you must be important. But individuation demands that you stop blaming women for not seeing you and start seeing yourself. really seeing yourself, not the image you project, not the role you perform, but the raw, unfiltered truth of who you are beneath all the pretense. This is where most men quit, because facing yourself is harder than performing for others. Taking responsibility for your own wholeness is more terrifying than making someone else responsible for your happiness. Jung understood that men who refuse this inner work become slaves to feminine projection. They bend like wet clay into whatever shape they believe will be accepted. You learn to laugh at her jokes even when they're not funny. You learn to agree with her opinions even when you disagree. You learn to want what she wants you to want. You call it compromise. You call it partnership. You call it love. Jung called it self-betrayal. You stop being a man and start being a mask, smiling, nodding, agreeing, performing until you forget who you were before you put the mask on. And women sense this. They sense it more than you could imagine. The very thing you think will make her love you, your obedience, your predictability, your constant availability, becomes the reason she loses attraction. Because the feminine instinct, Jung taught, isn't drawn to comfort. It's drawn to mystery, to strength, to the man she cannot fully define or control. The moment you make yourself completely known, without boundaries, without backbone, you don't become more lovable, you become invisible. But here's the paradox that keeps most men enslaved. You fear being alone more than you fear being fake. You'd rather lose yourself than lose her. You'd rather live as a character in her story than face the terror of writing your own. Jung understood this fear. He called individuation a path not for the faint-hearted because it requires you to die before you die, to let the false versions of yourself burn so that something real can finally emerge. The process is lonely, terrifyingly lonely, because as you walk that path, you begin to see things you cannot unsee. You begin to recognize the games people play, the masks they wear, the lies they tell themselves just to feel safe. And when you try to share what you see, they mock you. They call you cold, arrogant, too serious. They accuse you of being the problem. But you're not the problem. You're the mirror. And people hate the mirror when it shows them something they don't want to face. The man who has done this work, who has faced his own unconscious, who has integrated his own inner feminine, cannot be seduced by projection. He is no longer a puppet in someone else's fantasy. He becomes the author of his own reality. And when you finally reach that place, when you've done the brutal work of individuation, something strange begins to happen. People become uncomfortable around you. They sense it even if they can't name it. The weight of your presence unsettles them because you no longer fit into the predictable categories they use to feel safe. Jung warned that the individuated man is not welcomed by society. He is feared, misunderstood, labeled as distant or arrogant. But the truth is far more threatening. You have simply become untouchable, unbribable, because you see through the game. You see the psychological patterns that once enslaved you. You recognize the projection before it takes hold. You understand the unconscious dynamics that most people spend their entire lives acting out. The very people who once begged for your attention, your validation, your approval, they begin to resent you for not needing theirs. Women, especially those still possessed by the fantasy of the perfect man, will accuse you of being emotionally unavailable. They'll say you're too analytical, too distant, too much in your head. But what they really mean is that they can no longer control you. You've stepped off the stage, you've stopped reading from their script, and without that script, they don't know what to do with you. Because you've stopped being a character and started being a man. Jung observed this pattern in his own life. The more conscious he became, the lonelier his path grew. Because consciousness is isolating, truth is isolating. When you stop playing the roles others need you to play, you discover how many of your relationships were built on performance rather than authenticity. Friends who only liked you when you were their emotional cheerleader disappear when you stop performing that role. Family members who appreciated your compliance become hostile when you establish boundaries. Women who once found you attractive suddenly find you threatening. This is the price of psychological freedom, and most men, when they get a glimpse of this price, turn back to the comfort of unconsciousness. But here's where the real transformation begins. You stop seeking wholeness in someone else's eyes. You stop making women the carriers of your hope, your meaning, your purpose. Jung taught that when a man refuses to carry his own soul, he projects it onto a woman and makes her responsible for his completeness. He looks to her for validation, for direction, for permission to feel good about himself. But no woman, no matter how loving, can hold the weight of a man who refuses to hold himself. And when she drops it because she must drop it, you finally stand face to face with the truth that the work of becoming a man was never hers to do. It was always yours. This is the psychological liberation Jung wrote about, the moment when you realize you don't need to chase women, manipulate them, or perform for them. You stand still, fully rooted in who you are. And from that place, something miraculous happens. You no longer attract women who want a character. You attract women who want the truth. The shift is subtle but profound. Instead of women who are looking for someone to complete them, you attract women who are complete in themselves. Instead of women who want to fix you or change you, you attract women who appreciate you as you are. But this requires something most men find terrifying. It requires you to be completely, unapologetically yourself. Not the version of yourself you think she wants, not the version that gets approval, the real version. With all your flaws, all your quirks, all your rough edges intact. If this psychological revelation cut through your illusions, like this video. And tell me in the comments, have you recognized this projection pattern in your own relationships? At the beginning, I promised you Jung's insight about the unconscious feminine force. Here it is. Until you face and integrate your own inner feminine, your own capacity for feeling, intuition, and emotional depth, you will remain a slave to hers. The woman you're searching for out there is a reflection of the part of yourself you've abandoned. Until you face that part, every relationship will be a performance, every connection a transaction, every love a lie. Jung understood that men, like women, carry both masculine and feminine principles within their psyche. He called the feminine aspect in men the anima. When a man's anima is unconscious, he projects it onto women and expects them to carry all the emotional, intuitive, and relational intelligence in his life. He becomes emotionally dependent, unable to access his own feelings without a woman to reflect them back to him. But when you do the work, when you integrate your own anima, you become a man who doesn't need to chase. You don't run after women, you don't manipulate them, you don't perform for them. You attract someone fundamentally different, not a woman looking for a missing piece, but a woman who has done her own inner work. She won't flood you with grand declarations, she won't treat you like the savior of her story, she won't need you to carry her soul because she's learned to carry her own. She'll stand before you, whole in herself, looking you in the eye, not as a man she wants to mold, but as a man she's ready to meet. And you'll recognize her instantly because she won't try to cast you in her unconscious drama. She won't project her animus onto you and demand that you live up to her inner masculine ideal. She'll see you as you are, flawed, human, real, and she'll choose to walk beside you not because you complete her, but because you complement her. In that meeting, there is no desperation, no clinging, no performance, only truth. And that truth, Jung taught, is the rarest and most dangerous kind of love, the kind that demands nothing but offers everything. Because it is not born of need, it is born of freedom, freedom to choose, freedom to walk away, freedom to stand together without illusions, without masks, without fear. But let me warn you, most of you will never experience this because you will settle for the performance, you'll settle for the fantasy, you'll settle for being seen as someone you are not. Because facing who you truly are still feels unbearable. Jung's dark truth was this: most men will spend their entire lives as actors in other people's plays, never realizing they have the power to write their own script. But the man who chooses himself fully, unapologetically, relentlessly, becomes the author of his own life. He cannot be controlled by fantasy, he cannot be seduced by performance, he cannot be reduced to a character in someone else's script. He stands alone, not because he is cold or distant, but because he is complete. And from that completeness, he can finally offer authentic love rather than desperate need. This is Jung's ultimate teaching, that freedom is not the absence of relationship, freedom is the presence of choice. And only the man who is free can truly love. Subscribe if Jung's psychology opened your eyes to something you can't unsee.